Hello and welcome everybody to episode 68 of the Lookout Sir Warhammer 40,000 podcast. My name is Dan, and it is my privilege, pleasure, and patutanani, that's not even a word, but I was going along those lines, to introduce you to this wonderful show. And joining me, as ever, to, get us started, is my good buddy Phil. How's it going, Phil?
Yeah, good. I'm surprised I don't get like a double intro, because I can now take up Joe's intro as well as my own.
Well, exactly. Although, as you know, Phil, we're now a much more streamlined and/or, well-organised entity that only requires a short introduction. So if we extended your introduction to include what was once he who shan't be named anymore and his intro, then it just wouldn't work, would it? We'd just go on too long. It would be a horrible mess of a thing.
Exactly. Well, why don't you get on and tell us, or the listeners, what's happening in the show?
What is happening in the show? Well, we are going to be talking about, unsurprisingly, one of the most significant, if not only major events to have taken place in all of 40k. And that is obviously the Warhammer 40,000 update. So that will be the core of this show. I know, lots of exciting stuff to get stuck into. So we're going to be doing that. And as usual, we'll give our insights and thoughts and feelings on the various changes that represents. And then we'll close out the show by yet another outro rambly section where you and I just, catch up and see what's going on in the world. But but before we do any of that, we have to do a 5-star review.
Hang on a second, what is this? Some kind of review? A 5-star review? Well, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this Warhammer 5-star review.
So, this 5-star review comes from FGTRILOGYFAN via Apple Podcasts of Australia. Awesome 5 stars. I have recently come back to 40k gaming after a long break, basically missing all of 8th edition, which some would say is a bad edition to have missed out on. But that might not necessarily have included me throughout its entirety, but towards the end, good edition. I started listening to this podcast while looking for 9th edition Necron reviews, having sold all my old Blood Angel models to get the new Necrons. Well, there you go. I'm hooked. There it is. Great content and fun, not mechanically serious decisions on all things 40k, or an ability to read, clearly, on my part there. That all took on a life of itself. A great way to relax, enjoy 40k talk while driving to and from work after a 10-hour shift, like getting into a car with a bunch of mates. Keep up the awesomeness. Cheers, Pete, NSW, Australia. Boosh. So, thank you very much, Pete. We are obviously appreciative of the fact that you like the show. Hopefully you're enjoying it, that it is still just myself and Phil. But if you're not, don't retract the 5-star review. We still feel like we earned it. Phil, any thoughts or feelings? Would you like to thank dear old Pete for his awesome 5-star review?
I would. How can I not? Pete, you're a wonderful man, especially since you came looking for Necrons. You will never find Necrons here, so I'm sorry this is the wrong podcast for you. I don't know, maybe we'll do a bit of Necrons. I think we did Necrons
actually
once.
Do a Necron review, Phil.
It slipped in. None of us play Necrons. In fact, I've always been a lover of Necrons, though. And I'm sure I've said that before. That's what you're here for. That one day, 5 years' time, when I start a Necron army, and we'll talk non-stop about Necrons.
Maybe out of respect for Pete, we'll throw in some Necron talk at the end. What about them Necrons? So there you go. If you would like, your 5-star review read out on the internet, again, stating as always that we're a bit Ron Burgundy around this place, in so much as whatever you write down, I will probably read, although I will sift through to make sure that there's no, horrific stuff in there or anything like that. Don't go weird with it.
Sorry, no ads for OnlyFans. We don't want that.
But yeah, so ultimately, if you would like to hear your own 5-star review called out over the interwebs via myself and good old Phil, why not give us one via any place where you can put one? Apple podcast reviews seem to be the most prevalently featured, but I have called out some before in other places. Although, to be fair, we don't rigorously check some other places. So if you have put a 5-star review somewhere that might not be so universally normal within the world of podcast distribution, maybe reach out to us on our social media and tell us that it's there for us to shill for you, as it were. But anyway, there you go. That's us. That's what we're doing. That was our 5-star review. Thank you very much, Pete. And we hope that you enjoy our thoughts and feelings on the Warhammer 40,000 update. Transitional noise. Woo! Welcome back, everybody, to this part of the podcast, the main part of the podcast, where we're going to talk about the various updates, or, most of the various updates that the good people of Games Workshop have made to the Warhammer 40,000 rules. The first of which, I reckon, Phil, probably makes sense to be the Grand Tournament 2020 mission pack and all of the changes that are in there. Because you and myself, Phil, we enjoy a bit of the old, standardized Grand Tournament play, right?
Well, we haven't once played a standard core rulebook mission because
that's not true. That's not true. We did. When we got early access to the rulebook, thanks to your friends at that Oxford store in the summer, we did play a standard rulebook mission. Remember?
I got the maybe yeah. I remember playing the PDF one that came out for free, the open only war one, when they had the very basic. Yeah. Yeah, then actually, yeah, when we had a preview flick through of it, I think we might have done a standard mission then. Right. Yeah. There
you go. You see, was it like Custodes and or Death Watch versus your Minotaurs, wasn't it?
Yeah, it would have been Custodes versus. Oh no, the first one we did was you're right, Death Watch versus Is it Minotaurs then as well?
It was Minotaurs,
yes. And then we did a second game later on when we both had the books, which was Custodes versus Minotaurs.
There you go. But yeah, so as Phil has, somewhat accurately stated, we haven't played anything other than the GT missions, and it is our, assertion that everyone's pretty much the same as us, right? No one else approaches the game any differently than you and I. So based on that, we're going to deliver information based on that fact. Although, truth be told, Phil, I'll just put it out there. I still think Chapter Approved 2019 has the best missions.
They do hold a sweet spot for me as well.
Mate, like, if you want to hold a fun, exciting, interesting tournament that requires people, or just gaming event that requires people to think about army list construction and generally deliver a more varied and quite easy to understand, mission structure, Chapter Approved 2019's missions, Eternal War missions, superb. But, that's a thing of the past now. Now we have secondaries. Yay. But one of the things that they have finally done right is determining the first turn. I mean, Phil, how it is that Games Workshop didn't wake up to this reality prior to now. I mean, the amount of times these guys have failed to understand the significance of a, concrete determination at the start of gameplay and the impact that has on the overarching, nature of the gameplay experience is unbelievable. I mean, those who've listened to this podcast enough know that I hated the way that 9th edition rolled out its deployment step of the gameplay. But now, Phil, oh my, it's quite, a revelation, wouldn't you say?
Well, yes. So for those listening that might not, for some reason, in the last week have read the FAQ update, let's just tell them what it is. It's basically when determining who goes first, you roll off.
Well, here's the thing. They've completely removed any of the decision-making process from you. Now, personally for me, I still think it was probably sensible that you roll off and that you were allowed to make the decision whether you were a defensive player or an aggressive player, because I think you then were able to make certain army list strategies that favored certain types of builds. But in a way, this is interesting because it removes a certain amount of optimization, because now, essentially, you and I roll a dice, Phil. If I roll higher than you, I don't have a decision. I'm going first. Yeah. And that really has impacted the game in an interesting way, because in one way, it's a little bit underwhelming because now you can't prepare or build an army list with a specific kind of strategy in mind. because ultimately you can't have a degree of control over whether you're going to go first or second anymore. But at the same time, because you don't have that control, you have to, as a player, make a series of measured decisions about whether or not you know, how you want to build your army and how you want to go about, you know, making all this stuff happen. So it's very, very interesting. You know, and what is interesting as well, right? And this is one of the little nuances that also makes it a little bit rubbish as well, though. I've just got to say this. Mm-hmm. You roll off and you have to go first. This doesn't clarify or doesn't then overthrow the prior situation, which is we still roll off at the start to determine a table edge, and then we still take it in turns deploying our army. It's just the turn before we go first, or the roll before we go first, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So it's not one roll and then you can make a series of clever tactical decisions based on knowing you're going first.
Yeah. I got the impression that, I can't remember if at the end of 8th edition, at the Holy Grail of the old chapter approved mission pack, I thought in those days you would roll off, one person would pick attacker, one person would pick defender, or I'm picking my deployment zone, and if you pick your deployment zone, you're going second and the other person gets to go first. That gives you a bit more sort of tactical nuance.
Well, and here's the thing though, Phil, just to expand on that point there, mate, you got to decide whether you went first or second. Even in chapter approved 2019 they still mucked it up.
Yes,
they just got rid of seize the initiative, but they didn't prevent players from being able to decide whether they went first or second. I mean, personally, the way it's been done best is within the ITC 2020 pack, which was roll off. If you won the dice roll, you decide if you're an attacker or a defender. If you're an attacker, here are your inherent benefits. If you're a defender, here are your inherent benefits, which is, if you're the attacker, you know that you're the aggressor. You know that you can essentially, you know, deploy your army aggressively, but you deployed your entire army before your opponent. So your opponent, who is going second, had a chance to, you know, offer a defensive strategy, but also the defensive player also got to choose their board edge, which before the world of standardized, you know, mirrored terrain became a thing, was also really, really beneficial because they then could choose a more defensive position. So there were a number of inherent benefits to both scenarios. And as a result, it was just a better system. This is infinitely better than doing a roll-off that then allows you to determine to go second because that's advantageous to you. But it's still not what I want it to be. So I probably now need to kind of caveat probably my opinions from the outset, because I can't necessarily remember now how positive or negative I was about this initially, because
pretty positive.
Well, truth be told, upon reading it properly and understanding that, oh wait, hang on, I still don't know if I'm going on first or second at the point of deployment. Everyone who's reviewed this that I listened to hasn't made this very clear, and reading it again actually properly, because, you know, spoilers to some of our lovely listeners, sometimes we don't always get the time to read everything in detail until we get to this point.
Speak for yourself, Dan.
Well, all right, fair enough. I don't get the chance to read it all at this point. But yeah, actually, upon reflection, this is still not as good as I want it to be. I just want it to be straightforward. You and I roll off. I won the dice roll, so I make a decision. My decision has a series of benefits, but also some negatives. And then your, you know, the situation that you find yourself in doesn't have, you know, has its own positives and negatives.
Yeah.
It's just...
The only thing you need to worry about now is sort of like it's more about the roll-off for deployment zone, because that's where you get to make a choice of, are you going to pick or are you going to deploy second, which is only one model. So it's always advantageous, I think, to try and get the deployment zone. And then the other person's not really that much of a disadvantage. And then it's all just down to, well, let's just roll the dice and see what happens. There's no you said, there's no tactical decision in that second roll-off, which in a way just keeps things nice and simple and speeds up the game, so you don't have any sort of paralysis over that decision-making process. Although you do lose out on some tactical elements, but at the same time, it also stops a lot of shenanigans where if you're both deploying defensively, you'll force your opponent to go first, which is never a fun feeling to have that happen to you. So it's good that they've kind of written that out for the game.
Yeah, no, it's the right decision, but upon full evaluation of it and understanding, because again, you got to understand, I just assumed based on the way other content creators and other people had kind of expressed this to me prior to me properly reading it, was you and I would just roll a dice, and then because I won that dice roll, I make that decision at the point of deployment. But it's not at the point of deployment; it's at the point after deployment, and that is. No, it's still not fixing it.
You've ideally probably got to build your army to just know you're going second, or if your army is either Elder or Ultramarines currently that has abilities to redeploy, like those armies are now, they've got a real leg up, because like no matter what, they can put themselves in a defensive position or put themselves in an aggressive position. Sort of regardless, and armies that don't have those abilities, I think, are a bit of a negative. It would be nice if every army had at least some kind of ability to do that. Maybe it means more people need to just play a bit defensive, but put their more aggressive units into reserves so they can outflank. I think those sorts of tactics don't see much play at the moment, or at least I haven't been using them, because I'm always like, nah, just stick them on the table, it'll be fine. And then about to turn in, instantly regret it and go, no, why didn't I do that?
Yeah, it certainly unlocks potential for the toolbox that they've given us in the way of accessing reserves and certain other stratagems as well. But it certainly still leaves a lot to be desired. But it's better than it was, but not by a huge margin. The other thing that's really interesting is the way that they've also changed primary objectives and the take and hold / domination scenarios. So. One of the major complaints that I've got with 9th edition's Grand Tournament Pack is the way that every mission pretty much feels the same. And that is that every mission is, we hold objectives and that's it. And the game really had a real weird problem before this change came into effect, which is essentially in the standard 40k rule set, you score your primary objective of take and hold and domination in your command phase, right? So in your command phase, from battle round 2 onwards, you score 5 points if you hold an objective, 10 points if you hold 2 objectives, 15 points if you hold 2 objectives and more objectives than your opponent. Obviously, there's a number of variables there. You could hold 1 objective and hold more than your opponent, and that would be worth 10 as well. But anyway, let's not explore every possible combination that can create. The point is that's how it worked. Now, the nuanced difference is in Battle Round 5, the player who went second is allowed to score their victory points for the primary objective at the end of their player turn, which is interesting because on the one hand, it takes the game out of this really conclusive problem that it had, because in the way it was before, if I was playing Phil and I was ahead by, say, 10 points in my Battle Round 5 in my command phase, and I had some mobile units or I had some units that could apply some pressure to him, I mean, it might be like, you know what? Nothing else matters but just getting OBSEC units within range of Phil's objectives just to deny him those points. And in doing so, create a situation where I make it impossible for Phil to win. And it doesn't really matter to me what he does in response, because ultimately I've just locked him out. Whereas in this version of events, Phil could actually still very comfortably respond to the scenario at play and potentially, claw back a close win against what would have, under the, old scenario, been a comprehensive loss. So based on that, take on things, Phil, what's your feeling on this as a rule?
Yeah, I think since Ninth has been out and from the games that we've had, everyone sort of got the general impression, even though it's quite subjective, that if you go first, you're at a big advantage. That you can have in your turn, you can jump on those objectives turn 1, which means you're potentially scoring them from turn 2, whereas your opponent has to not only get on that objective, it's got to then shoot you or shift you off of those objectives. So it's instantly, when you're going second, you're on the back foot. And as you say, in that last turn, you can just deny me doing anything. In my last turn, all I'm doing is scoring secondaries. Whereas now it gives me that one extra turn to try and move my models onto those objectives and try and shoot you off of them or charge into you to get around it. So I do like it. It feels odd that it's just for the last turn. It sort of really harks back to the old rules where you always scored at the end. Yeah, I'm keen to try it out. Basically, it sounds interesting. It's interesting. It's a bit odd, I think, because it just affects one player. So it feels very off balance, but is a balancing mechanic. So I can see why they've done it. I think you just need to play it now. It'd be interesting to see if people will deliberately. I don't know, because you can't even aim to go second. That's the other thing. So because it's a random thing, you can't necessarily build your army to go second or try and aim to go second. You can, because it's a 50-50 chance now. So
yeah. Well, you can now develop strategies to play for the late game, right? So you can now develop strategies that will enable you to, as the second player, potentially claw back your wins in battle rounds 4 and 5, which was a problem that really didn't exist with the way it was before. The way it was before was, cool, I can't win now. Great. It's battle round 3, battle round 4. I'm out. Don't worry about it. Let's not play anymore.
I think the weird thing with that is you're still going to be playing a game, and going second, you're still potentially going to be losing by a lot up until turn 4. But you've just then got to have the kind of, not necessarily confidence, but that's how it's meant to be played. But I effectively get like an extra turn of scoring, or the way my turn scores at the end is different. So if I'm like 10, 15 points down, be like, oh, actually, I can win this back.
Yeah,
and that's sort of how the games are meant to be played. Whereas normally at the end of each battle round, you top up your points and you go, I'm ahead a little bit, or I'm losing by a lot, or I'm winning by a lot. So now you've got to not necessarily worry too much about what that end of round scores look like, because it's all to play for up until the very last turn.
It's a very unelegant solution. And one of my major bugbears when it comes to any rules is, the elegancy of its execution. And again, I always use boots on the ground as my example of a very, very well structured, balanced, obvious rule. If all you've got left on the battlefield is planes, you've lost, because planes cannot hold ground. And that rule, and its evolution when it became aircraft, is just a really clever, well thought out solution to a problem. This is a hot fix, and if I'm honest with you, it's not one that I'm particularly happy with. I think the thing is it opens itself up to other forms of exploitation, and also as well, it's just not consistent. It's one of those things where, why not unlock this ability from battle round 4? Why not just make it that the second player always scores at the end of their turn? Yeah. Why not create that kind of dynamic? Why not potentially look at game systems like Magic the Gathering, who have 2 main phases? You have your upkeep, and then you go into your main phase, then you do your combat, then you do a main phase again. There's some other phases in between. My Magic the Gathering knowledge isn't as robust as hopefully others might be. But the point is that, you create a system that facilitates this. Because the other thing that's really interesting to me as well, and it's not something we've seen yet, but it's going to be a curiosity to me to know if something like that is around the corner, is, the command phase has a number of, potential opportunities for Games Workshop to explore other rules ideas. And if, for example, Games Workshop introduce some, command phase specific abilities that could influence points gathering. How does that interact with this rules decision, and will this rules decision stay the test of time? I think the thing is with this is it's a halfway house solution that will, stand for the next 6 months. But eventually, when they finally get around to doing Grand Tournament 2021 mission pack, they'll hopefully have a more elegant solution worked out. But it's fine. It's just one of those, it's a bit pat your head and rub your belly for me, if anyone out there
I get the feeling. I know what you mean when you said it doesn't feel equal because it only affects one player. It is interesting, but it does, like say, feel like a bit of a fix for a wider problem of someone going first has an advantage, which when you score at the end of the turn never really felt like that was as big a problem because you have a turn to solve and do stuff. It's a bit of an odd one. It'd be interesting to see if it does change over the next, like I said, 6 months, or if they stick with it. Yeah.
The only other rule that isn't related to the secondaries is a change to embark, which is essentially, unless specifically stated, other units' abilities have no effect on units while they are embarked, and stratagems cannot be used to affect units while they are embarked, which was sort of something we all knew, but I guess it's just them further cleaning up the language around the fact that if you're in a vehicle, you can't, re-roll ones to hit if you're, I don't know, a Drakari player with a Archon inside of Venom with 5 other, Cabalite warriors. It doesn't work that way. You're not considered to be on the battlefield for the purposes of abilities or stratagems.
There's a whole bunch of rules kind of clarifying how embarked works with open-topped vehicles. So one of them is the one you said where they say basically you don't benefit from any abilities. But the very last one says if the transport model is under the effects of modifiers to its range attack, such as modifiers to hit rolls, wound rolls, etc., the same modifiers apply each time to the embarked models making the range attack. So things like if your transport is shooting or would shoot through dense terrain and would be -1 to hit, the troops inside also are. I was wondering if there were ways that could abuse this, where if you could give plus to hit modifiers or wound rolls, for example, on your shooting attacks, then it also would buff the units inside. But I think there's so few of those abilities that I don't really think that's much of a problem.
No, I can't imagine it would be either. Again, though, it's good that they've clarified that certain negative effects also take effect on embarked models. I mean, again, they're sort of weird because they're everywhere, but they're also quite an outlier in terms of the fact that they've really cleaned up a lot of the vehicles. Because once upon a time in editions of old, it used to be that a lot of vehicles, even rhinos, had fire points. It was always like, 2 people can fire out of a rhino because...
Those are the days.
Those were the days when people would used to model one... tactical marine with a melter gun hanging off the side of a rhino or whatever. But obviously they got rid of a lot of the fire point stuff, but then you still got things like the Drakari, you've got stuff like the Chimera, you've got stuff like the
Chimera isn't, it's a transport, but it's not open topped.
But you need a crew inside it. You need people in it to use the las array.
Yes, the las gun array, yeah. But that isn't open top. That just shoots as if it's a vehicle, but requires people inside to shoot.
Yes, yeah. But in a way, it's the same style of rule as what open-topped is. Essentially, an open-top vehicle is just a vehicle with loads more guns. If there's 10 things inside the vehicle, it's a vehicle with 10 extra guns. That's the simple logic of it. So when it comes to secondaries, one of the first ones that received an update is While We Stand, We Fight, which Joe actually used quite a bit, but isn't one that I've seen many people get too excited about. And historically, what it used to be was the most expensive models in your army needed to be kept alive. And in doing so, for every one of those that you, the controlling player, kept alive, you receive 5 points. Now it is any unit. So any unit, or rather your most expensive unit, now becomes eligible for While We Stand, We Fight. Now, where this has become quite interesting is in the case of the Custodes, because the specific language used in the rules has specifically stated that even if the unit has the ability to split, you will not receive the victory points for killing that unit until every single model in that original unit that is split apart is slain. So Custodes, as you've probably heard from a lot of people, have access to an ability with their Terminator squad to split it all down into one-man units. And in doing so, you could have 6 individual Custodes Terminators, which you need to kill, all of which to get 5 points from. So there is some weird janky stuff that goes on with this, but putting all of that to one side, I personally think this is a real improvement, because I think the way it was before was not really enabling it to be a strong option for a number of different armies, whereas now I think it's got a little bit more versatility, a little bit more functionality. I mean, for you, Phil, not that you'd ever do it, because Bolgrins are not your friends, but you could take a big unit of Bolgrins and all of a sudden you can go While We Stand, We Fight, and then all of a sudden Bolgrins with 4-up invuns that you can boost with psychers and other things.
Yeah,
are quite hard to get rid of, right?
Yeah, they're pretty sticky to shift, that's for sure.
Yeah,
I think even with like Marines, you get the option of doing a lot of Gravis units, so you might take heavy intercessors or Inceptors. Inceptors, you can deep strike them, so you could deliberately keep them off the board for a couple of turns as well. And then when you do come in, you could combat squad them, so it's like now you got 2 units in completely different parts of the board.
It's really strong for the Indomitus kill teams from Deathwatch, because those things are so tough to get rid of. So tough to get rid of. Yeah, that's a...
I do like the fact that it's got the option to... It feels like it's opened it up to more armies beyond just Tau, who were always taking it.
Well, yeah, but also it's Custodes and Tau, I think, were the two big ones. It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because, again, Tau probably isn't an army that has massively enjoyed a number of huge advantages in this edition. So losing out on While We Stand, We Fight might... Or not that they lose out on it, because they can still pretty much get away with using it because Riptides are so expensive. But even then, it's an interesting change and something that I think does go a long way. So there you go. That's an interesting one. I can't really think. I'm trying to think, Phil, because I mean, is that going to benefit a guard player in any way? Not really, because your tanks are always going to be the most expensive things, aren't they?
Potentially, yeah. Outside
of obviously the Bolgrin.
Yeah, example. I mean, you could do certain builds, for example, where you make sure that your basilisks are your most expensive. It also depends on at what point you determine it, because obviously a lot of tanks start off as units. So and then they split when you deploy them.
Oh, my god!
You could go, I've got a basilisk squadron. Now, when you deploy them, they're 3 individual units, so you've got to kill all 3 of them, and they could be running around the board, hiding out line of sight, for example.
Based on the fact that it's
3 regular tanks as well.
Yeah, so based on the fact that they're stating that when it splits, if a unit splits into several smaller units during the battle, all of those separate units, excluding drones units, must be destroyed for the original unit to count as being destroyed. So, yeah. So if you had a 3-man, tank squad's really good. Yeah, so you could deploy 3 Lehman Russes, and until all 3 of them are dead, you're not getting the points.
That actually is much more viable than normally in the old rules. It would go on your tank commander because he's a more expensive one, and then the tank commander tends to be comboed with other things like assassinate as well. So he'd be a prime target for killing. Whereas now you could still take tank commanders, but you could select, like I said, 3 Lehman Russes, the standard ones, because that overall, or even just 2 of them, would be more expensive. But like I said, if 3 makes it harder to kill.
Wow.
So yeah,
that's actually quite useful then for the guard players not wanting to rock the Bolgrins, and same thing with other options that have similar sort of exploits, I suppose. So yeah, I suppose the only thing I'd need to probably double check and clarify is exactly when secondaries are determined. Are they determined at the point of which you turn up and stand, before you even roll a single dice? I assume that is the case. It is before you even start deployment.
I think so, yeah.
So you'd go around and you go, these are my most expensive units. So this two tank unit of Lehman Russes, this 3 tank unit of Basilisks, this other 2 tank unit of Lehman Russes, and those are my while we stand, we fight.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think that would work, yeah.
Sounds legit, mate. Sounds legit. Good times. And on that topic as well, and another thing that has massively benefited the Guard, but also massively benefited a number of armies, is the changes to bring it down. Because one of the most egregious issues with the secondaries in the GT pack was, in my opinion, bring it down, because it punished so many core builds for so many armies. Like, as an Elder player, the key to a good Elder army is an abundance of vehicles. You want a lot of vehicles. You want a lot of grav tanks. You want a lot of flyers. You want a lot of, walkers and other things. Wraith lords, all this stuff, right? But the amount of points you were scoring for dropping that stuff historically was, very, very punishing. Whereas now you only score 1 victory point at the end of the battle for each enemy monster or vehicle model with a wounds characteristic of 10 or less. So 10 or less, that is significant as well, because so many mid-tier walker type vehicles like dreadnoughts or, again, Wraith Lords or, other sort of smaller vehicles have a wounds characteristic of 10 or less. Now, I can't remember exactly, Phil, but I think it might have still been 10 or less originally. But yeah, you've essentially halved the amount of victory points that you get for that.
Because those units, can I just interject, things like Sentinels, for example, they would often come in squads, so you get 3 of them. So you could just rack up your points so easily by taking out those smaller units quite easily.
Yeah. Whereas now as well, so if you're 11 to 19 wounds, so in the bigger kind of tank territory, that's only worth 2 victory points. So if you're a monster or vehicle with 11 to 9, then if you're destroyed, you get 2 victory points. And if you have a wound characteristic of 20 or more, then you're worth 3 victory points. So obviously that's where you're getting into the super heavy territory, but you can also look at... trying to think if there's any 20 wound things that aren't super heavies. I'm sure there's something.
Yeah, well, monsters possibly.
Possibly. Maybe a greater demon of Nurgle or something like that.
Yeah, it's a bit of an odd one, because I think, isn't it 16 or more is where you can be sort of targeted regardless when you're behind obscuring. Correct. So it seems odd that it's not pointed at that level. So you've got your big category is sort of consistent across the rules.
Yeah, true.
As opposed to just saying 20, which feels a bit arbitrary. But yeah, it's a good change for sure. I was constantly hemorrhaging max points in all my games. When I went to No Retreat, for example, I was taking a tank list quite deliberately. And yeah, people would always be getting 15 points against me.
Easily, yeah. And now, if you took that same list, it'd be unlikely that they could get... Oh, no, they probably could still, because you had a lot of tanks, to be fair. I
think I had 13 or something. It was
so it's still very much up for grabs. But, but then, in the world of old, they only had to kill 5 of that 13 to get it, whereas now they have to kill 10. Or... not 10, sorry, maths. But they've got to kill 7, 8 of them to get the 15 points.
Yeah.
As opposed to just 5. The other big change as well, and this is certainly something that I'm really excited about as an Eldari Craftworld player. Well, it's a good change, Phil. It's a Bore the Witch. Now, Abhor the Witch is, in my opinion, still very punishing to Grey Knights and to and to the Thousand Suns.
Yeah.
But for armies where you want a little sprinkling of psychers, you want a little dash of spikers. I mean, we called this out when we did our initial review of 9th edition, right? We were like, what are they on? Like, how the heck did they arrive at 5 points for a psychic character? It was just bananas. Whereas now they've decided that a psyker character, which is most psychers to be fair, is only worth 3 points when you slay them. And if it's a unit with the psyker keyword, then it's only worth 2. So actually, this is quite a significant change, because if you were to combo Abhor the Witch with Assassinate, you could have a Warlock, which is a 2-wound, 4-up invuln, toughness-free little guy. A few weeks ago, that guy was worth 8 points if you dropped him. It's like, wow. That's crazy. In fact, Phil, you experienced this when you and I played, right? Way back when, because you used to take 2 Astropaths, and I was like, whatever, I'll just put Abhor the Witch in, because I was like, it's worth each one of these guys, because I think I had Assassinate as well against you. I was like, each one of these guys is worth 8 points. Yay!
I'm pretty mad for a little character that's just there to like cast off, like, oh, +1 save, oh, -1 hit.
Yeah. And he's wearing like a few rags and carrying a stick.
Exactly.
The most valuable.
Does he have like a 6-up invuln, or maybe not even that? It's just he's got rubbish save. He's a bit of a dirt cheap character. Although weirdly, I think he's gone up in points by about 10 in this.
Well, they do unlock a lot of strong builds potentially, because the psychic powers that
the psychic powers
are
good. What makes them worth it, basically.
Yeah.
So it seems it's a good change. It does make taking 2 or 3 psychers sort of worth it now. It lessens the reason to deliberately not take psychers, because I think that was something you pointed out a while back, of this is a good build to deliberately not take any psychers. So when you're up against them, you can take this, because it just scores so well against other armies. So I think now you're encouraged to take at least 1 or 2 psychers, because it's not really going to score much against people. And I do like it when secondaries aren't always max scoring, that they do sort of cap out around the 10 mark or less. Yeah. I think there's better choices in the game than when you're sort of stuck with those decisions, that you're not going to get an easy 15 points.
Yeah. It's really important, man. Like you need some amount of back and forth. You need some amount of, you need some hard decisions in the game. It really irked me very early on in 9th edition, which we still really are. Let's be honest with ourselves. But in the early days of 9th edition, where Games Workshop were like, it's all about, you're not going to be able to break the game, and we're really focused on, balance and all the rest of it, and scoring like 90 plus points in a game is really hard to do. And then very quickly we see tournaments, and, people have already very quickly optimized certain types of build, and people are winning, their tournaments with, finishing every game, scoring 100 points every time. And you're like, wow, this is, I
still think getting max points is pretty difficult, but against if you're a good player against a bad player, you could probably quite easily do that, which I think shouldn't be the case.
Well, exactly.
I think my personal preference, if they were to, go one step further, I would make it that secondaries don't stack against each other. So, for example, if you're taking a character that's a psyker, you can't score Assassinate and Abhor the Witch against them. When you kill them, you would actually have to, if you did choose those 2, you have to pick which one you're going to score. Just because then it stops these certain characters, things like tank commanders that are vehicles, that are characters that would also score for, as it grind them down. Sometimes you can max 3 different sets of secondaries against one model, which seems preposterous. So I think making people do that extra choice, I think, would be a nice little change in the future. But I think what they've done so far, I like the fact they're even balancing the secondaries. I think that's a good sign going forwards, that they are going to look at them, tweak them, and adjust them. I think that's all really positive. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, mate. And I think, I think even if they just made Abhor the Witch not actually able to be
taken in conjunction with assassinate would be a good move. Like, just even that, like, you know, just be like, actually, a Bore the Witch is so very specific that it can't be taken in combination with assassinate, or, as you said, introduce a situation where you just have to pick one. It's like, cool, you killed a psyker who happens to be a character. Which of the secondaries are you going to benefit from today? Which is a good thing. Only other stuff, I guess, that we probably might want to look at is some of these rare rules entries. I mean, there's quite a few extra ones. One of the interesting ones to me was always fight first/last. So they've been specific with some of the language around always fights first/last. And that is to say, add the following paragraph to the end of this rare rules entry. Note that counter-offensive stratagem, which is the 2CP stratagem which allows you to interrupt the flow of combat, requires you to select a unit that is eligible to fight. This means that if a unit is under the effect of a rule that says it is not eligible to fight until after all other eligible units have done so, you will not be able to select that unit to use the counter-offensive stratagem. And that's a big change, right? I mean, that is huge for a lot of armies, because all of a sudden you've run in, say you're Drakari, right? And you've got that Vexator mask on your homunculus. And you've charged that guy in alongside some Incubi or whatever it may be, which is Hellions. I mean, that's never going to happen, but maybe it will in the new codex, who could say? But you've charged him in, and your opponent's gone, cool, I've tanked a few wounds from this, I'm going to interrupt now. And it's like, well, no, you can't. And that really, really changes things for the benefit of certainly the Drakari stuff with the Hexator mask, Space Marines with the Judicar. But according to our friends at Rapid Fire Wargaming, does a big old bunch of favours for the armies of Slanesh, which they seemed quite thrilled about.
Yeah, because their ones, I think, is more about you're always fighting first, as opposed to making your opponent always fight last.
Correct, yes.
So yeah, if that's the case, that's really good. Like a nice little buff.
Very strong. Very strong. There's a few other little rare rules entries. I don't know if there was any of them that you wanted to call out specifically, Phil, or any of them that you wanted to get into.
Not from the Grand Tournament ones. I think there's some interesting rules clarifications in the main core codex. I think we've also talked about like transports. I think there's one specifically about super large or very large models that are sort of too big to fit in the deployment zone. They basically just clarified it that if it has a base, you measure to the base, and it doesn't matter if the model actually hangs over the edge of the deployment zone. So things like Richard's Marauder Bomber, which is so big you could never really fit it on the board properly, or at least it wouldn't fit in the deployment zone. So they've at least clarified that for those very large models, which I think is
that
a good
Marauder Bomber must look absolutely ridiculous when deployed on the smaller boards now, by the way. I mean, on a 6x4, it was still massive, but imagine looking at that thing on the 60 by 44 inch board that they've given us now.
Yeah, it's going to take up a lot of space. And similarly, there's one in terms of disembarking large models as well. So basically, if your base is bigger than 3 inches, you basically have to deploy within 1 inch of a transport. So in theory, you gain a little bit, you gain an inch basically with those models that otherwise shouldn't be able to legally disembark. I think that's quite.
Well, there are instances where, like Tyranids, for example, you can put monstrous creatures inside of their.
I think it is.
Yeah, the drop pod type thing that they've got.
I think that's probably the one instance where that's going to pretty much what it's talking about, because I can't think.
Yeah, because even the Dreadnought drop pods are only specifically for smaller Dreadnoughts now, aren't they? Because you can't put Leviathans in Dreadnought drop pods, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't know how big the base is on the.
They're not 3 inches, I don't think. But then also you got the weird flappy side bits that come off it. So who knows on that front, mate? But anyway, it's good that they clarified all of that stuff. But there we go. So, Phil was proactive now that we're the new improved Lookout Sir 40k podcast. And he actually took the time to put out a little community post with the assistance of Richie as well, actually. Shout outs to Richie.
I posted it in the end because you didn't
did
do
you?
it. So take that back.
You're useless,
retract. Richard. Yeah, useless.
Retract the shout outs to Richie. None of the glory for you. Anyway, look, we wanted to see what people thought about the updates and if they had any questions that we might pretend to seem knowledgeable about and answer for them. So we're gonna get into that now, I guess, and see if there's anything that people out there wanted us to talk about. So, Phil, what's our first community question?
So we start off with Archon John. He says,
Archon John. I wonder what he's going to ask about.
I know. Spoilers ahead. Drukhari points changes seem to be one of the most sweeping of all the factions in a good way. Welcome your thoughts. I'm also going to follow this up by a second person because it's a similar thing. Mr. Sky Serpent on Facebook, who we all know as Paulie, the head honcho from the Real Space Raiders podcast. Casual, shameless plug for them.
Exactly. Check them out. The other podcast that Joe welched on.
Exactly, yes. Poor old them. We've all lost Joe.
Exactly, the precursor to our pain.
I know. He says, who won the 40k update and why is it Drukhari? He then followed it up with saying basically everything from the core rules, secondaries and points. We'll see when Codex comes out for those lucky enough to play, but they seem like they're in a good spot. And I think the Drukhari update is an interesting one because some of the armies, for example, seem to have a massive load of points changes. And this is interesting just in and of itself. Normally, points changes are reserved for chapter approved, which comes out either in December historically, but I suspect they might be moving to a summertime release, similar to how it was last year. Partly to tie in with the launch, but I suspect maybe that's just when they'll always be going forward. So it sort of makes more sense to have a 2021 update for a year when you can actually use it for at least like 6 months, as opposed to when it comes out in December and it's technically for the next year. Always seems a bit odd. So it's interesting. They've had loads of updates on their points. Some have gone up. A lot of them have gone down, actually. Things like Talos's gone down 15 points. It's interesting also are these the new points in the future codexes for all the armies, or for at least the ones in the very near future? So if Drukhari is going to be coming out in the next 2 months, are these the same points costs? It would sort of make sense that they are. Because some have gone up by quite a lot of points. So like Drazar's gone up 30 points, for example. So maybe hints for what will come in the future codex.
Yeah, I think Drukhari were an army list that has enjoyed... so Drukhari on the whole is an army list that's enjoyed a relative level of stability in 8th edition and subsequently 9th edition, although they've never been top tier and haven't been probably since 2018. I think 2018 they were really very, very strong. And I think in 2019 they were also really very, very strong to a point around 8th edition. But very much when the new Marine decks dropped in 2019, Drukhari were one of those lists that every single one of their advantages was absolutely done over by new Space Marines, because new Space Marines just had so many answers to the problems that Drukhari were throwing out. And unlike their Craft World counterparts, the Drukhari just didn't really have the durability to stay in the fight. And what 2019 Space Marines did to the meta, what they did to the game, was make it all about this insane level of durability. And it was so hard to outlast and outperform a Space Marine army when you're made of paper, especially when the ITC was taken into consideration and there was a heavy emphasis on kill more and hold more. So Drukhari are trying to hold down loads of objectives with fragile units, of which there are many. So things just kind of drifted away for them in 2019. And In early 9th edition, they've struggled a lot because of the fact that so many of the secondaries really punished them, as we've already kind of gone over. The Bring It Down secondary was so punishing to Drukhari because Drukhari need loads and loads of like transports, venoms, things of that nature to perform. Whereas, historically you were getting 2 victory points every venom you killed. Now you're only getting 1. So if you're coming up against a Drukhari player who's got 6 venoms, maybe 3 ravagers, that I believe the ravagers are only 10 wounds, but maybe they're 11 wounds. And again, this will be me making a mistake. But even if they're
a Drukhari player on the show,
well, or I just had access to a modestly, underwhelming app that I could just tap in a Ravager into. Oh no, come on, you. No, okay. Apparently, I oh god. I don't know how to spell today. Doesn't matter. The point is how many wounds they've got. The point is that they're not nearly as punished as they have been historically, which is a plus. And then ultimately there's a bunch of other stuff in there that's obviously played to their benefit. But yeah, reducing their points is great, and the changes to certain secondaries is great. To your point, whether or not this is a precursor for what's going to happen with the main or the new Drukhari Codex, I would assume that this is not the case, so that these rules are here to support the current Drukhari for a while longer. Oh, Phil?
I was going to say the Ravager is 10 points. Sorry, 10 wounds.
10 wounds. So only worth 1 victory point. So again, so you take, 5, 6 Venoms, 3 Ravagers, that's only 9 points for Bring It Down. And they're still quite tough to bring down because they've all got 5 up in Vuns and those Venoms are -1 to be hit. No, they're not. I'm thinking of a different thing. Oh, no, they are. So, yeah, it's just one of those things where Drukhari definitely have been bolstered by the changes. And also the change now that if they're going second, no one's as quick as the Drukhari. So the fact that you can, in your last battle round, make all those big, bold plays to get on all these objectives and get that big 15 points at the end has been a big old change for them. So, yeah, look, I think I can only really echo Paulie's sentiment. I mean, he's a very knowledgeable Drukhari player, and I'm sure Archon John is the same. And, yeah, look, I think, we can only really speak to the positives for Drukhari, which is a good thing. I think it's a great state of the game where an army like the Drukhari are back on form. If I can be so bold as to try and talk about their Craftworld counterparts, which are obviously my preference, I think those are much improved as well, but not to the same extent as maybe the Drukhari are. But again, I think still there is some interesting things there. The last thing I will say on this side of things is it's interesting looking at the points, because I hadn't realised before that Cabalite Warriors could be 20-man units. I thought they capped out at 10. So it's weird to imagine that you could sort of do a horde Drukhari army. I never really considered this before. That's quite a significant shift in potential options, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Do we have any other exciting questions from people, Phil?
Yes, but weirdly, none really relating to the FAQ.
Brilliant. They just asked general questions.
I thought, yeah. We've got one from Tabletop Journeys. This is over on Instagram. He says, thoughts on the new Death Guard rules leaked by Games Workshop on the community website.
We'll get to that at the end. We'll get back to Tabletop Journeys.
Exactly. I was going to say we're surely going to be covering Death Guard in a couple of weeks' time because their codex is upon us almost. Yeah. We can get around to that later on. We'll have a little bit of a chat about it, I guess, in the rambly bit at the end. But so no other ones for the general update, no? No, there was just one more which I'll read out because we're here. Why not? One was from good old pal Cantor Blue. He was basically asking whether range-specific armies, such as Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors, can still consistently compete. He seems to believe that most of the armies now, like the meta armies, are all about close combat and board control. So he's like, can they do well despite them not being that great or having the best chapter traits and not being board control or assault orientated?
So a lot of that question is answered by the irritating relativity of tabletop terrain, and I think within standardized ITC tournament table structures, I think the close combat orientated armies perform exceptionally. Can't talk. They do very well. Because ultimately they're able to exploit a number of the inherent advantages of a table covered in ruins. We've had this conversation multiple times, but the game of 40k, in my opinion, shouldn't be such that it rewards that specific kind of flavor of army so extensively. In a way, that was one of the major issues with third and fourth edition, which is why in fifth edition they made drastic changes to the ways that the combat system worked, and then in sixth edition they even went back to introducing Overwatch as an attempt to try and quell the community, because there was such a ridiculous problem with older games of 40k, specifically around Tyranids. Like, so few people in old not second so much, but like third and fourth edition 40k knew what to do about Tyranids. Like, they would just rampage through you. I mean, I don't know, Phil, do you have any early memories of playing or seeing Tyranid armies and how people just used to have this kind of paralyzing sense of fear when they'd see this, horde of gaunts and big gribblies about to run at them?
I can't say I do. But
no, you don't remember the old days of when Nids were just ridiculously efficient.
I do remember having a fun doubles game with Richard. In fact, I think it was my first ever doubles game. So we were playing with your Blue Meanies, which was Thousand Suns and Zeech Demons. And basically we were up against, I think it was 3 or maybe 4 of the, I'm trying to think of their names, the big brood...
Tervagons, or not Tervagons, Tyrannofexes, no.
It's that size, but it's the other variant, the one that can spawn all the Hormagaunts.
Yeah. The one that's got all the gaunts coming out of it, yeah.
Yeah, so it was basically like 4 or 5 of them and basically a literal bag of Hormagaunts. And they literally just tipped it out on the table, and every turn they were just coming at us.
Yeah,
quite fun. I think we did win that in the end. Basically, we had the tactic of just every turn marching backwards ever so slightly and shooting at them. And I can't remember how the mission was. It must have been something based around kill points, because we eventually won it. And I was just rolling incredibly well for all the dice rolls, which was a great intro to tournament play and the 6th edition rules at the time as they were.
Yeah.
Speaking,
you got introduced.
Oh,
sorry. I was going to say you got introduced to the core concept of if all you do is roll 6s, you can be very good at this game.
Exactly. I was like, this is brilliant.
It's the best, isn't it? I think as well, though, like, just to say on that Tyranid front and what they were historically, like, they just because in the old rules, so like in 3rd and 4th edition, what used to happen is you'd get a model into combat, right? So you'd get like one Gene Stealer into a line of Tau. Like, I mean, this was how the game used to go. Literally, a Tau army could delete a Tyranid army for 2 turns. But if 1 or 2 Gene Stealers got in, that Tau player lost, because the way it worked is that they could go into combat and then go into another combat, and then they could just keep going from combat to combat. So they just used to literally just mow through people's back lines as soon as they got in. It was just utterly ridiculous.
They would lose the roll off in terms of who won combats, and if the unit ran away, which invariably did, the Gene Stealer player would have a good chance of just running them down because they rolled up by a number, which meant they auto killed the unit no matter how many models were in that unit. Even if you had one model and they had 10, for example, you could run them down and kill them, and then you could
it was a good system for what it was, but it had some flaws. But to speak to your point though about ranged things and with the changes that they've introduced and how that works, I think again it's massively dependent on tabletops. If you play with official Games Workshop terrain and you play a normal game of 40k, ranged is still the strongest thing. The problem is that no one playing it hyper competitively is playing with those same scenarios. They're playing it with very, very, very specific terrain that has created a meta all in towards itself, which is, here is my army of toughness 5, toughness 4 in certain instances, heavily mobile, high armor saved, feel no pained units that are just going to tar pit you. But before they tar pit you, you're going to be frustrated because the terrain allows me to perfectly position everything so as you can't do anything to stop me from doing what I want to do. And that, to me, isn't really a fair representation of a fun, interesting, balanced game. A topic that I want to bring up on the show in the future is about the terrain conversation, and is there actually a more optimized and more sensible terrain layout that actually makes the game truly more interesting and competitive? Because I think the problem with the way that certain ITC tournament organizers use terrain today, it just favors very specific armies, and I think that is unfortunately not a very fun representation of the game.
Just to hark on that, I think you almost need a sort of a percentage breakdown of different terrain types to appear on your table. You don't want 100% ruins. You want maybe 50% ruins or 60% ruins. You want a bunch of craters. You want a bunch of sort of the small obstacles and barricades, for example, and lots of sort of scatter terrain in that effect. And you want some dense terrain as well, which is some kind of woods, I guess, or something that can represent dense terrain. So I think with that, it creates a much more sort of balanced gameplay, which, because they even say in the core rulebook, like if you have too much terrain, it favors assault armies, and if you have too little, it favors shooting armies. So you do need that kind of Goldilocks spot on the middle. But while we're talking about ruins, I was going to highlight the one extra point of the FAQ updates from the core rulebook that I wanted to talk about, which was the reinforcement units and engagement range. And this is the one time where we get a nice little diagram appearing. And this is a diagram that has been dodgily drawn on many a Facebook post over the last 2-3 editions, maybe. It is, or at least in the last 2 that I can remember. Basically, you have a unit teleporting down 9 inches away from a unit on the 2nd floor of ruins, or 1st floor if you're in the UK. If you're an American, you're on the 2nd floor. So you're one level up, basically, and the levels are 5 inches apart. If you draw a diagonal line, you are 9 inches away from your, let's say, Terminators, because they've deep strike in. They're on the ground floor. They're 9 inches away. Now, technically, to get into engagement range, which is the floor below, you actually need to roll a number that's a lot less than 9. They say here it's 8. I think it's probably more like 6, depending on the rules in question, and how high your ruins are, I guess. But anyway, you need a number lower, and normally the assumption has always been that it's 9 inches no matter what. That's the stipulation, that it's sort of no matter what, it's 9 inches. But here they've actually kind of ruled it in the other way, and they've actually said if you can get into engagement range, and that's, say you only need a 6 or an 8 or whatever it is, then that's the number you need. So sticking stuff in on top of ruins can be more dangerous. They even actually say if a ruin is several stories high, you can actually if you can deep strike down on the very top of a ruin, and for example, you then only need to go down 1 floor to be within engagement range of something on the floor below that floor, then, for example, you only need a 5-inch charge, which is quite mad. But
it's a terrible ruling on their part, isn't it?
I always like the fact that it was 9 inches, no matter what. It kind of makes sense, though, like that this is how it should be played. I don't know if it's the best. I think it almost just discourages people using ruins with lots of multiple levels. And as part of that terrain talk I'm sure we'll have is the fact that no one really ever seems to put stuff on ruins anymore. Everything is become a lot more of a flatter game. And
it has to be said, man. And
inventory.
And we'll definitely get into this conversation in a later episode. But yeah, the game has become so much more 2-dimensional, which is super boring, in my opinion. I think people's appetite to continue to pursue the competitive element has robbed them of the creative, fun aspects of gameplay that were there for the taking before. The fact that people have gone away from Realm of Battle boards where there was at least some, elevation in favor of mats. It's just very, very specific decisions done to favor very specific logistical decisions, which have value, right? I mean, I absolutely 100% agree that a standardized, sensible format for tournament play is an appropriate aspiration. But I think at the same time, it needs addressing with more of a kind of balanced and sensible discussion rather than just kind of agreeing that two massive L shapes and a bunch of other ruins dotted around the table is the way that we all want to do it. And rulings like this frustrate me because, again, it adds in there's a simple, clear, thing to, in an example where you arrive from reserves, irrespective of the actual physical reality of your figurines on a table, there is a design decision that we have taken around rolling a 9. And rolling a 9 is a decision that we have taken because it is mathematically improbable, but not impossible, that you will roll a 9 or more on 2d6. The odds are not in your favor, right? Like it is a third of the time you will get, or not even maybe a third, it's like a quarter. I can't remember the specific maths in it, but it is not
a 1 in 3 chance of pulling off a 9.
Yeah, which to me is a very sensible mechanical decision, a risk versus reward mechanic. Whereas if all of a sudden I'm in a situation where, as you say, Phil, I can get on top of a 10-inch high ruin and then only need to charge 5 inches down to drop a level, and then I'm within engagement range. It's like, guys, come on now. Like, you again, it's one of those weird things where I wonder whether they're thinking about problems of previous editions where, they had to change the way the fly keyword worked to address this issue. So, yeah, this is one of those ones that, for me personally, I think if I was playing in any kind of competitive setting, even though this has actually been ruled that way, I would at least address the conversation with my opponent and just say, hey, just want to double check, how are we going to play this? Because I personally still think it's a bit janky. What do you think? And if they go, no, it's the rules as written, fine. It's like, okay, cool. Well, give them the opportunity. But you might find more people are in favor of rolling a 9 or more than getting into a weird debate with you about whether or not they've satisfied the absurd criteria in order for this to come into effect. But every advantage is worth taking, I suppose.
It's this weird thing of the whole engagement range issue was really to solve the problem of people blocking an entire floor. So when the charging unit can't physically reach them to be within an inch, which was seen to be too gamey. So they basically said you can, if you're on the floor below them, which is effectively 5 inches on their terrain, that you can do it. But in doing so, it's kind of created another smaller problem as well. It's probably quite a minor one. It's just something to be aware of when you are putting units on tops of ruins, for example, and your opponent is definitely going to be deep striking or outflanking units. I guess in a way it sort of mitigates units like Reavers that have an ability to ignore vertical movement. I don't know if their ability actually affects the charge phase, though. I suspect it might not.
This is one of those weird ones where I start to quote 8th edition rules and assume that they still exist in 9th edition, because the way 8th edition have ruled it is that a fly keyword model, and 9th edition is the same for fly keyword, which is you can move over infantry when you're making an assault move, but you can't move over obstacles or buildings or terrain features. So you can't go over stuff that you can't go over, but you can go over, you can go over infantry, but you can't go over buildings, which was a sensible ruling. But then in 8th edition, they kind of extended that to other things like flip belts and all sorts of stuff. But in this, they haven't. I'm not sure is the answer. I don't know. Probably.
I've got one other thing for you, not to do with the core rules. It's a faction-specific one.
Or should we at least give our man Cantor Blue a little bit of a final thoughts on whether we think a ranged army can work in competitive 40k?
Yeah. So my take on it is potentially. But the thing is, the game is one on board control. It's not one on shooting. So if you can shoot, cool, but you still need the ability to get to the mid table and hold your own. You can do that without close combat units. I play predominantly a guard army with almost no close combat stuff, with the exception of Death Riders. But I think the meta, not just the meta, the game itself fundamentally favours a very mixed army that has some shooting, has some close combat. You don't want to go all in on either. So if you've just got shooting, you're going to be a bit of a disadvantage. Although saying that, Space Marines, for example, are, a standard Space Marine can still punch the living daylights out of most things, just with its fists. So Marines are still good in combat, even without close combat specialist units, but their close combat specialist units are really good. Armies like Guard, for example, unless they take Death Riders or Bullgrins, do struggle in that kind of close combat arena, for example.
See, I think to counteract what you just said there, Phil, I think unfortunately the game has, at the higher competitive levels as it is currently, massively gone in favor of these combat armies, because the problem is, as I say, it's terrain. Terrain is the problem. Because the thing is it's not like they're using proper GW terrain, and not that they have to, but they all use special terrain that you can't see out of or you can't see in of, because they still go, oh yeah, well, it's a ruin, but I still get true line of sight. So we've blocked off these windows here, or we've done whatever, so you can't see them from these angles, and it's always a series of decisions that I'm just looking at going, cool, you've just sort of gone, again, you've stacked the deck in your favor, and it frustrates me a little bit to see it, because it makes the game very one-dimensional, as I say.
Yeah, you are right in terms of a lot of tournaments, for example, built terrain specific for 8th edition, and in that they took either Games Workshop stuff or they built custom stuff, and they blocked out the lower floor, because that was the general consensus of the lower floor blocked line of sight. So a lot of tournament organisers or terrain manufacturers just produced terrain that didn't have any windows, for example. If you still play with that terrain in 9th edition, though, it is not only is it obscuring, but it is effectively permanently obscuring even to the units inside it, because now there's no longer windows for those units to be visible from. And the way the game is meant to be played is, if you're behind a ruin, you can't be shot at. But as soon as you go into that ruin, you should be visible to shoot in and shoot out of. If you basically just have a solid wall that you can't see, then you can obviously sneak up on units much more easily. So yeah, I think that is potentially a bit of a hangover. That's partly a practical level of people collecting, painting, building terrain, and then going, oh well, I've got this now, I don't want to just get rid of it.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of entrenched ideals around things, and people just liking things a certain kind of way, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that I think if you look at 40k, the rules writers have got this really, really awkward situation on their hands again, because their testers and their competitive community are still playing a slightly different gameplay experience to most people. And that's always the problem. They're writing rules and trying to balance things based on problems that not the everyday player is going to experience. And it gets weird. I think ranged is still infinitely stronger than assault when played normally. But when you're playing very specific setups, it's that way. But anyway, Phil, go on then. Last thing, and then we'll do a little summary, and then we can move on to whatever it is that comes next.
Yeah, so this is sort of a hot topic I've noticed in the competitive 40k. Our dear friend Richard has been weighing in on the subject along with some other people.
I can't believe it, Richard.
It's
wading in on the competitive 40k forums. Never.
It's an interesting one up for debate, so we can put it out there as to what the audience thinks is the right answer. It's to do with Tau. Those plucky little fish. It's the Montcar special rule. which they've updated. So basically it says, in a turn in which a sept commander unit from your army declares Montcar, at the start of your movement phase, you can select any friendly sept units within 6 inches of that unit. Until the end of that turn, the selected unit can shoot as if it did not move this turn. Unless stated otherwise, you can only use it for Master of War ability once per battle. So the way this is being interpreted is you can fall back from combat. You can then go Montka, and you can select that unit that fell back, and now you can say it is shooting as if it has not moved. And because of a stipulation for being able to shoot after falling back is via the fallback move, they're saying that this rule does not apply because it counts as if it didn't move. So there's two schools of thought.
I think the nuance of the situation is they've added 3 types of movement, haven't they? Well, they've actually 4 types of movement. So there is standard move, falling back, advancing, and not moving or stationary, right? So they've added that stipulation to the selection. And because they have specifically given a status to not moving, it is now a state that you can enter. So ultimately, if you fell back, that is a move. But in the same way as this rule would turn a normal move or an advance even into a they didn't actually move at all, then it applies. So I would argue in the same way it could be done to a unit advancing, because it would reset the status into something else. It just depends on the specifics of how this ability activates. So in a turn in which a sept commander declared Mont Kai, at the start of your movement phase, you can select any friendly sept unit within 6 of that unit. Until the end of that unit, that selected unit can shoot as if they did not move this turn. So what's interesting about that as well is, right, so you do that at the start of your movement phase, you select the thing, and then I assume they do their move, and then they don't count as having moved anymore, right?
Yeah.
So theoretically, yeah, it's totally fair game, in my opinion. It sucks, but it's fair game.
Yeah,
I mean,
ultimately, the way some people are reading it is, but they still fell back, so you're still, yeah, but it's a weird one because the shooting ability having fallen back isn't in the shooting rules; it's tied into the movement of the fallback move. Interestingly, it's not saying they remain stationary, which is the specific name for when you're not moving. Which is remain stationary. Models cannot move this phase. Hasn't said that. It just said that as if they've not moved, which means you ignore, in my mind, like I said, the fallback, the advance, the normal move.
Yeah. So again, there was a really specific thing with it when it came down to, because the Ultramarines had this problem. Because the Ultramarines would fall back, and in doing so, they could still shoot. But if they were in the tactical doctrine, they were assumed to have never moved, so they could fall back and still fire. And there was a lot of conversations around that as well, in terms of the fact that, well, you still did fall back. And it's like, yeah, that is ultimately true, but again, it really depends on how you...
Yeah, because it doesn't sort of say you can still... Because in a way, it's like, is the ability to fall back and shoot, does that need to be specifically stated to negate the fact that you have fallen back? Because obviously, I think it's designed to say you can move and shoot your heavy weapons without a penalty, like that, or which feels like that's the obvious one it's talking about. Then you could say, but is it to negate advancing and shooting? Yeah, maybe. But then by that logic... Hang
on. No, right, okay. So the devil's in the detail with this, right? So actually, I'm going to do another little 180. So the specific wording of the types of movement is normal move, advance, remain stationary, and fall back. So if a unit remains stationary, none of its models can be moved for the rest of the phase. Any units from your army that were on the battlefield and were not selected to move in the move unit's step of the movement phase are assumed to have remained stationary that phase. Remain stationary. Models cannot move this phase, right? So that's the specific wording is remain stationary. In this ruling, it doesn't use that terminology. It uses the terminology of until the end of that turn, the selected unit can shoot as if it did not move this turn. Now, that is very different because it's not the specific wording, and you've got to assume that these guys, when they write these FAQs and deal with these things, know that there is a specific wording for a specific state. So even though it will count as if they did not move, they still fell back. So in that instance, they can't do it. Well, had they said remain stationary, it would have been fair game.
Yeah, that's the thing. Can you stack different types of movement? Could you have said, I have remained stationary because of the nobility says I've remained stationary, but I still fell back, in which case I'm still subject to the fallback rules? Well, or does my remain stationary override the move that I actually did do?
So there are abilities where, for example, if you advance and fire a weapon, that weapon changes its status to assault. So that is a change of status type ability, right? So it says you fire this as if it were an assault weapon, or you treat it as if it was an assault weapon, or it is, so like when Black Legion advance, their guns become assault weapons. It's very specific about the language that's used there. You have changed the type. And there are negatives and positives associated with that situation, because the assault bolt gun variant can't shoot as much as a rapid fire bolt gun, but it can still shoot at -1 to hit after you've advanced. Again, if you think about it, that they've got these varying kind of like trump cards, or these, these wild cards, if you will, that ultimately they can take on any kind of form, but you need to have that specific language in the rules. Remain stationary is a specific status that they have outlined as an option, but if a rule doesn't use the same language, then it doesn't have the same stipulation. So ultimately, even if you fell, even though you're treated as if you didn't move, you still fell back. Because
do you know what? I too am making a U-turn, because I believed originally that it shouldn't affect the fact that you fell back. But the fact that it says you count as having not moved, to my mind, overrides the fact that you fell back. So actually, you can fall back and still shoot, because it doesn't say you're remaining stationary. It specifically says you count as having not moved, which includes falling back. So in my mind, it overrides it, even though I hate it and I think it's a bit cheeky. But like you said, they specifically worded it in that way.
Here's the thing, though, mate. I mean, people can interpret it one or two different ways. And I think, again, it's those edge cases that become irritating because, again, it's not addressing the variables. And, again, it's another one of those GW 40K problems that we see over and over again, because they don't think about the full picture and they don't think about how certain scenarios come into effect. And it is frustrating, because immediately a competitive player looks at this and thinks, aha, an advantage. Or not even a competitive player, just some general player will look at this and go, aha, an advantage. Whereas somehow the guy writing this for GW didn't think, oh, what about falling back? It's obvious enough, isn't it? It's like, no, it's not, mate. So yeah, whatever the case with the Monkai, which is weird, actually, because isn't Monkai... Oh, no, it's Monkai is Tau for... Or is it Monkey is Tau for humans, isn't it?
I've got no idea.
Okay, I think it's... Or is it Kion? Oh, I can't remember now. It's so many things. Oh, no, there's Kion and there's Monkai. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is, whatever the situation is with this Monkai thing, interpret it yourself, guys. Agree it with your opponent up front. At the end of the day, it's the easiest, most sensible solution to 99% of all the problems you could ever face in a game of 40k is if you've got something in your army and it could be interpreted a bit janky, because let's be honest with ourselves, you've probably encountered some kind of discussion as a result of you doing this in the past, or you're aware of the, conversations within the forums. Just ask, whenever I rocked up with my Elder Flyers, for example, I would always clarify a lot of the weird nonsense that was going on at the time with them. And you'd always make sure that people were comfortable with the way that you were doing things and how you understood certain very specific rules, interactions that you're going to rely on in later turns. So yeah, just talk to your opponents. Most of us 40k folks are lovely people and will be completely and utterly rational and understand where you're coming from. But equally, if we don't see it the same way you do, that's also something that obviously needs to be accepted as well, because at the end of the day, 40k is a collaborative experience and something that ultimately doesn't happen unless we both agree on the various outcomes that rolling dice and moving small plastic men around a more two-dimensional board, as we said earlier, and so on and so forth. So Phil, look, let's just summarize this with some nice final thoughts and feelings on the updates. What is your opinion on the updates, Phil?
It's all right. It's pretty good.
It's all right, yeah.
It's all in a positive direction. It's hard because obviously we just haven't been playing many games. So I think that's one of the weird ones. I think all the rules clarifications are pretty good. Like I think all in a good direction. I think the things around first turn and rolling off to go first are ones that may change in the future. As you said, it does feel a bit of a patch to a larger problem that could maybe be resolved in a slightly different way, which maybe one day we'll work out what that is. The points updates is an interesting one. Again, no one's really played the new edition all that much. But yeah, it's kind of welcome. It sort of is a bit weird that it not necessarily invalidates Legends, but obviously there's a bit more of a discrepancy between the stuff that has changed and the stuff that hasn't, even though points changes have only just come out. So, for example, to talk about Krieg for 1 second, ding, 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 you can now take a drink. And drink about Krieg this episode. So a Storm Chimera, I think, is 95 points. A regular Chimera is now 65, although if you give it 2 heavy bolters or 2 heavy flamers, it's 85. So it's only 10 points cheaper. But base with a heavy bolter and a multi-laser, it's 75 points. So a 20-point difference. And all that's different is there's a autocannon instead of a multi-laser. I don't know. A minor discrepancy, but again, a point about how Legends is already invalidated to a small extent because the points have changed.
There you go.
Other than that, I think it's pretty good. What's your take on it?
I think it's a band-aid on otherwise quite broken scenario in some regards. I don't think it's horrifically broken. I'm not going to suggest that there's a lot wrong with it, but I think this fixes a number of problems, but it doesn't 100% address those problems, which is fine because that's the nature of where we're at in this side of things. Like ultimately, when Chapter Approved 2021 hits, I'm sure that will address and satisfy a number of the more concerning criteria that has been going on with early 9th edition. The points changes are really interesting and something that I've been getting my teeth sunk into. I think the points changes are already starting to showcase a number of interesting trends within Games Workshop's design decisions. Obviously, they have done points increases to things that need points increases, but they've also done a huge amount of decreases, which again continues to contradict a number of decisions that they made early doors. I mean, one of the things that seemed very evident to me from the outset of 9th edition was that everything was going up in points. That was a very clear mandate amongst 9th edition, is we're going up in points. But now you're finding a scenario where, despite the fact that they've had that initial kind of growth in points, they're now doing what they always do, which is essentially scaling it back again and going, oh, wait, no, we were obviously a little bit harsh to make this many points, so we'll take that down. And we'll take that down.
Base units such as infantry have gone up slightly. So, for example, the guard infantry has gone up by 5 points a unit, which is very interesting because it's 0.5 points per model. fun view on the Warhammer app where they obviously can't do, I think, 5.5 points a model. So they've just given one model for 50 points or 55 points, and all the rest are 0 points, which looks a bit odd. So I think they're trying to add in that granularity, because in previous editions you used to have squads of 55 points, for example, whereas the whole points, because it was per model mechanic, it feels like they've gone back on their 8th edition pointing, where every model had a point and every piece of war gear had a point. They're now almost going back to sort of 7th edition, where it was like, this is the unit, this is the base cost of the whole unit. It's not per model, but we do have extra points for some models if you're adding them on, or if you're swapping out war gear, there's an extra cost involved to that too. So yeah, interesting that they're sort of going in that direction. And they did some fun fixes that we didn't talk about, like the apothecary for Space Marines, bringing back back to life, which seemed completely ridiculous. They've obviously solved that obvious thing, which is good.
Shed a tear for the guy that bought 9 ATVs, eh?
I know, because they are the worst model ever created.
Oh, come on now, let's be fair. They're up there, but they're not the worst.
The Taurox, maybe. Anyway, we've talked things like Inceptors went up in price, which obviously I've got a bunch of. So it sounds like,
which again was a weird decision to me. Make plasma Inceptors more expensive, not regular ones
that everyone was sort of spamming.
Because they're too good. Like plasma Inceptors, fair enough, but regular Inceptors are nowhere near as good as plasma.
So it's odd that they've updated it to the base price as opposed to the weapon option for when you add on the plasma. But it sort of makes sense, but it's not ideal, I would say, especially when I've got a ton of the bolt ones as well as the plasma as well. So yes, thank you, Games Workshop. Otherwise, a lot of the updates seem to be good.
My last little bugbear, though, as well, is that they've still not managed to properly update the Death Watch on the 40k app at the time of recording. So, bizarrely, they've updated the Standard Marine listing. So, Outriders in a Standard Marine listing of 50 points an Outrider. But if you want to take a Fortis kill team, there's still 45 points, according to the app, for the Outriders. So, if you take Outriders in a kill team, based on Games Workshop saying that, the app is updated with the official points, according to them, it's cheaper to have Outriders in a kill team than it is to have them on their own. Same with every other variant thing that goes into a kill team. They've mucked that up, and they still haven't added the Indomitus kill team.
But to an extent, fair enough. It's free for another month, so that's good.
Sort it out, though. Sort it out. Ridiculous. Come on now, get it sorted. Jeebus. Anyway, there you go, guys. That was us talking about the update and a bunch of other stuff. Who knows how this all turns out in the end. Bizarrely, just to let you in on some secrets, there was a lot of editing in that particular segment. So hopefully it all came across relatively sensibly, because we definitely cut it up a bit. But there it was. There it is. And there it is. Wonderful. Bye-bye. Transitional noise. Woo! And that's it, everyone. The end of episode 68. Or not the end, because who knows how long we're going to talk for. We actually did quite a reasonable amount of time up to this point, Phil. So I reckon we draw the line somewhere between now and quarter to midnight. And I reckon that'll be a relatively reasonable amount of time, however long that ends up being.
Well, we can have a chat, see what happens next.
Exactly. That's always the way. Well, we could kick off by talking about the... who was it who was asking us about the Death Guard?
Oh, that was...
That was...
Just double check. It was Tabletop Journeys.
Tabletop Journeys. I think that's a guy called Luke, I think.
So he was like, he's talking about the Death Guard rules shown on the community website. He's like, they're going to be tough as hell to shift. An army-wide -1 damage thanks to disgusting resilience. I love the narrative flavour, but wow.
I think, first of all, it's really interesting to hear someone express positivity towards towards this change because, broadly speaking, it's been met with a relative amount of negativity by Death Guard players, but also by a lot of other community members. Like, people ran the numbers on this and essentially arrived at the conclusion that Disgusting Resilient of old is a far, far stronger ability than what they've turned it into, the -1 damage. But again, I don't necessarily think that people have fully considered the situation when they start to make those sorts of statements, because -1 damage is very, very strong, especially as we are seeing with more and more armies having their damage characteristics increase. So there's a lot more damage too coming down the pipeline in 9th edition. And as a result, the Death Guard ability does become even stronger because so many people will become accustomed to having units with very high AP damage to weapons that are really good at chewing through, your standard unit of Primaris Marines, but all of a sudden now are only killing half the amount of Death Guard. And that's before you even start to then consider the impact that this will have when you start to consider their 3 wound, potentially 4 wound Terminator squads, which are going to be utterly horrific to chew through, right?
Yeah. I think you're right. I do think the new one, the -1, sort of a nice and easy mechanic to get your head around, speeds up the game because you're not constantly rolling stuff. When I did a game recently with Tim via the Wonders of Tabletop Simulator, he was rolling pretty well for his Disgusting Resilience of old. And it was super frustrating. So at least you're much more aware of it now, and it's not just down to dice rolls, so you can kind of, you as an opposing player have a lot more onus on what you can do to work around that -1. You know what your weapons are or what weapons you can bring. Statistically, I think it works out better on infantry. The old the new -1 works out better on low wound units like infantry, but works out less in your favour for sort of high wound things like vehicles. Whereas if you rolled pretty well with your Feel No Pains, you'd save a lot more wounds than just one. Overall, I think it's a good change. It still makes them tough, though. It's like, geez, they will not. It just
creates a really interesting sort of relationship with Death Guard and the mid-tier elite units, and I think that's where the damage 2 characteristic is being reserved for. It's where we start to see the more mid-tier elite units. So if you think about Blade Guard veterans, you think about the Incubi, you think about units of that ilk that are now starting to get close combat attacks with damage 2. And then you start to think about other kind of, weapons, ranged weapons that will potentially start to have their damage increased to 2 as well. You're looking at things, I guess, like the Stalker bolt rifles for the Space Marines. We know those are damage 2. There is a number of Necron weapons that have damage 2 characteristics on their kind of more mid-tier elite units. I think, that's where you're going to start to see a lot of these damage 2 weapons, and that's where the Death Guard really will thrive. The problem is for the Death Guard, though, and for a lot of people is that, potentially it depends on where the meta kind of, evolves into, because if there's an army like the Death Guard doing the rounds, that is such a strong counter to very elite options. Those elite options are going to massively lose their appeal, and then that's going to potentially then shift people into other categories, which is going to potentially be a horde-based armies to speed up, movement and to gain more board control, or it's going to be, very, very resilient, big, scary vehicles that are just going to, smash into pieces, or really super powerful characters. Again, there's all sorts of ways that this can evolve and all sorts of things that this can turn into. But it's interesting. I quite liked, again, going back to it, I quite liked Mortarion and what they'd done to him in this new codex. So Mortarion's one of the few new units that we've seen the rules for, and there was quite a lot of interesting changes to him way back when, which I thought were
Yeah. So he's got one of them was he's got is it like his warlord trait? He can change every turn, or
Well, there's a point. I mean, I've got the data sheet up in front of me, and I mean, there's nothing about his warlord trait in there. Is there something else they not leaked, but something else they released around his warlord trait? Is there?
Just trying to think. Well, if we pause it for 1 second, we're going to go off to the article and find it in question, because it's not on the sort of wrap-up article.
Through the power of editing, Phil, we'll get to a point where you know what you're talking about. Here we go.
2 hours later.
Yeah, so it turns out at the start of the game, you can pick your warlord trait for Mortarion, which on the first face of it, you might be like, what's the benefit here? But if you're going to a tournament, for example, where everything in your army is locked in to your army list, that also normally includes your warlord trait. This is a nice little bit where you get a bit of extra flexibility, where against each matchup, each opponent that you're playing against, you can give yourself a different warlord trait, which is just like a nice, cool little ability. And I think sort of almost any of the Primarchs or any of those kind of supreme leader warlords should have this kind of ability.
I mean, what's interesting about it as well, if you read the entirety of the rule, is that it's a warlord trait in addition to a warlord trait, right? So at the start of the first battle round, select one of the following warlord traits. There's a bunch of, rotten sounding names. You cannot select a warlord trait that another model in your army already has. Until the end of the battle round, this model gains the selected warlord trait in addition to any others it has, even if it's not your warlord, which, based on the fact there's a bunch of rules for Mortarion being your warlord by default, is unlikely to occur. But yeah, so it's double duty on the warlord traits, which is quite incredible. And yeah, he's no slouch, man. I mean, Mortarion's an interesting insight into what's to come. I think, Death Guard have definitely got the potential to be a very, 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 very strong army. The contagions of Nurgle, if every unit in your army has the Death Guard keyword, excluding unaligned units, this unit gains the following ability, Nurgle's Gift. While an enemy unit is within contagion range of this unit, subtract 1 from the toughness characteristics of models in that enemy unit. I mean, stuff like that is super irritating.
Contagion ability late game, so from round 3 onwards, because that's when it gets to 6 inches, is going to be super annoying. Yeah. And also you can combo that with the just trying to think of the name of it now. It's miasmic malinifier, I think it's called. It's the new chimney stack terrain piece.
Oh, so, yes. The Nurgle chimney.
Yeah, so according to the article, you can set it up 12 inches away from your opponent's deployment zone. So obviously you can set it up in the mid-table. And if that's going to be having, by turn 4 onwards, even turn 3 is 6-inch aura around it, where you're giving everything -1 toughness, that's huge. So it'd be interesting to see how good that thing is, because historically terrain pieces in 40k tend to be a bit rubbish.
Well, except for the Nurgle ones historically, because the Nurgle tree used to get so much play.
Yeah, I forgot about that one.
That Nurgle tree used to be so utterly abusive, especially with the fact they had the demon keyword, so you could deep strike it and all this other nonsense. It was like, oh man, what a load of old rubbish.
Is that in the new edition, or have they written it out?
What, the tree?
Yeah.
Don't know. I mean, I assume it's still going to be in the Death Guard book, because it was in the Death Guard book of old, so maybe they've added an extra terrain feature.
Yeah, I just wondered if they would have shifted that over to be AOS specific, and then this is their new version of
Seems a bit unreasonable to people who maybe bought it for 40k armies, though, right?
I mean, unless, of course, you have a Gorgon or something. I mean...
Or maybe potentially... Well, yes, of course. I mean, let's shed a tear for the... I think, I suppose the thing is, though, maybe they migrate the tree over to being part of the Demon Codex as opposed to being part of the Death Guard Codex. I mean, who knows in terms of how they're gonna potentially look at that. I would assume the tree would stay, because why not? But no, I mean, and also I was going to say, I think Death Guard on balance I mean, well, unless I'm being completely mad, I mean, Death Guard are the only complete 8th edition range, right? Like they're the only army other than Primaris, of course. I mean, crikey, let's not forget the Primaris. But, you know, they're the only actual full 8th edition range. Like there's nothing in
battle. They were all obviously brand new. Obviously, here and there, like Crusaders are still metal, but the majority of Sisters obviously brand new range. Because Gene Stealer Cult was much more end of 7th, wasn't it?
Well, yeah. Well, they were end of 7th, but they did get quite a lot of updates in 8th. So they added all like the vehicles and the bikes and a number of extra characters. But yeah, Death Guard and Sisters are definitely like the two mainstay ones. I mean, and they're just a gorgeous range, though, man. I've got a lot of.
They are stunning models.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. What do you think of, actually, on the topic of the Death Guard, what do you think of their combat patrol box?
Oh, I'm going to have to look it up.
Have you not seen it? So their combat patrol box, I will tell you, so while you're looking it up, everyone else can hear. It contains 39 small toy soldiers. And the 39 small toy soldiers are 8 Plague Marines, 1 Typhus, and 30 Poxwalkers.
That's fun. 30 Poxwalkers. Pretty cool.
I mean, it is cool, and it is thematic, and it is interesting, and it is a theoretically interesting box. But I suppose the thing that was interesting to me is when you look at the...
Sorry.
Please, what were you going to say, mate?
It's not out yet. Right, because I'm looking on the website and it's not there.
No, yeah, it's on the pre-order. It's going on pre-order this weekend.
Let's see.
You got to go onto the Warhammer community site, mate, and look there. Everyone hold for Phil as he as he starts looking. But
around the clunky Warhammer community Sunday previews. Okay,
Sunday previews. There you go, Phil. You're on it, mate. You're on it. You're working it out. You're playing the room.
Yeah, okay. I'll do, new cards. Very cool. Okay, Combat Patrol.
So Combat Patrols are usually about 85, 80 quid, right? Like they've established the Combat Patrols about 80 quid. So would you pay 80 quid for that?
Probably not. I mean, a lot of models. It's weird because Typhus and his crew... Wait, no, it's not even those guys. No, it's Typhus on his own, yeah. I assume. I don't know. Like, how many of these are the easy build Poxwalkers?
Well, all the Poxwalkers are the easy build. Obviously, Typhus and the Death Guard squad are not. But yeah, the Poxwalkers are from Dark Imperium. I mean, this is the thing that's sort of really interesting about it, because in the case of the Death Guard, obviously, we've just come off the back of a lot of this, the contents of this box being widely available as part of, of the 8th edition box set. The I literally said it a second ago and now I've forgotten what it was called. The Dark Imperium box set. And I think that's one of the interesting things. It's like, Dark Imperium, if I remember correctly, Phil, was maybe 85, 80 quid for the big box set with the rule book and
maybe 100 max, but it was around the 90 quid mark, I think.
Yeah, so if you assume that Combat Patrol boxes are 95 or 85 quid, and you work on the assumption that maybe Dark Imperium was around 90 to 100 quid. Well, in Dark Imperium, you got that Lord of Contagion, you got characters, you got 20 Poxwalkers, you got the Death Guard drone, the Blight drone, and you got some other assorted bits and pieces for your Death Guard army, and obviously you got all the Primaris stuff that went alongside it. It's one of those things where you sort of look about. It's sort of still relatively fresh in my mind that Death Guard were 10 a penny as of
Yeah, even to this day, probably all the Death Guard stuff goes super cheap on eBay because you not only did you have Dark Imperium that people were splitting and selling off, but you also had the Warhammer Conquest magazine.
Yes.
And basically, the popular ones are always sold out with Space Marine. Death Guard ones were pretty much left on the shelves. Some, obviously, especially like the characters, were a bit more popular. But yeah, so I would almost assume that Conquest would have been cheaper to buy them. And even then, I think that was still more expensive than buying the Dark Imperium and then sort of, going halves with someone else. But I think the thing is, those box sets are always such good value deals. You can't necessarily compare the two values of like, why is this Combat Patrol not as much a saving as Dark Imperium? It's like, well, because it's not Dark Imperium. Like that is a crazy box saving. That's the whole point about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's just the interesting thing, though, from a decision perspective on their part, to then turn around and go, but we're now just going to give you like stuff that was established as being part of this incredibly good bundle, and we're going to charge you more money for it now, which is fair enough. I mean, look, it's their prerogative; they can do what they want.
If you're a new player wanting to get into the game, I guess, because I'm pretty sure the original Dark Imperium stuff, did that go off in its own box, like the kits at all?
No, it just doesn't exist outside of, it's gone. So easy build Poxwalkers were broken down as part of the easy build range of old. So the easy build Poxwalker kit used to be 6 Poxwalkers, I think. I can't remember. It's probably like £8 a tenner for 6 Poxwalkers. And then there were the easy build Terminators, which featured that character fella and his mateys. I'm not sure if they still exist. I assume they would do. And then there were the easy build Death Guard Space Marines, and those guys, I think if you bought them as easy build, they only came in a box of 3 with some slight alternate sculpts. So a lot of stuff has gone with the introduction of the new edition. However, looking at this, it also does look like you can get the free of the other heroes from Dark Imperium. So you can get the guy with the big bell over his head. You get the sorcerer, and then you also get a unit champion, which is an odd thing to throw in there. But I mean, ultimately, it's still an option. So yeah, you do now get the option to buy some of the characters from Dark Imperium. But again, this is all stuff that I suppose if you'd been collecting over the last year or two, you could have gotten Conquest for $7.99. But who knows how much GW is going to charge you for the privilege of buying these guys as a free pack now. Maybe it'll be like £25 or whatever it is, and it's a bit like, ooh, that's a bit pricey, isn't it, for something that I don't know. It's just one of those things.
I think there's that thing of, if you're an established Death Guard player, you're not going to get this. It's aimed at new people getting into the
of course.
Getting into the faction. But as I said, there might be cheaper routes online to get these things. It's an interesting one, just the fact they've gone Poxwalker heavy. It's very thematic. Poxwalkers have gotten slightly better as well. They've gone to toughness 4 now, and always hitting on 4s, whereas before it was based on their unit size, which I thought was quite interesting. So I think thematic-wise, it's cool that they've just done that, and they haven't given you the generic. We've given you a character, we've given you a squad or 2, and then we've given you a vehicle. So it's cool. And obviously, if you do want to go Poxwalker heavy, there's probably the cheaper option than just buying a ton of the standalone Poxwalker boxes.
Yeah, because, looking at it, so the old 6-man Poxwalker boxes were a tenner in the old world. So, if you were to buy 5 of those boxes, you would get your 30 guys, but it would cost you £50 for the privilege. Whereas now they've also expanded out the Death Guard Poxwalker box to 10 minis, but who knows how much they're going to be charging for that. And again, that's going to be an interesting conversation, right? Because if 6 of them were a tenner before, are you going to be charging £15 for 10, or are you going to be charging £20 for 10? I mean, again, who knows, right? It seems a bit...
At least 15, I would have thought, but it'll be interesting to see how much.
Well, you'd hope so. When have you ever seen a Games Workshop box for £15 in the last 10 years, Phil?
I know. Speaking of Warhammer Conquest, I believe there was a rumour going around that there's going to be like a Conquest 2, although something by a different name floating around. which would be interesting. So I presume if that was the case, it would be either the Indomitus stuff or the Phobos range that they did last year.
Or a combination of both, right?
Yeah, quite. It feels like it would be too soon to do the Indomitus stuff. But because I think last time it was like it was the sort of tail end of the edition of 8th when they put out the Dark Imperium stuff. So yeah, it's either the Phobos stuff because it's in between, or it's the new Indomitus stuff to promote the Indomitus, like the edition.
I mean, credit where credit's due to them. Credit where credit's due to them on the initial Indomitus release. They still haven't re-released that Ultramarines Lieutenant, have they?
Oh, which one was that?
The one moving forwards with his sword being released from his scabbard or from his sheath or whatever they call them. But yeah,
sorry, you're talking about the Warhammer Conquest Lieutenant.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, him, yeah. No, that was a limited edition just for that, and they've not brought him out any other place. But I guess it's a bit like the Dark Imperium Banner Ancient, for example. That's a model you could only get in that set. Obviously, they did release it in Warhammer Conquest as well, but beyond that, there's never been a way to just be able to buy them. So it is odd that sometimes there are these models that are specifically just in one kit, and then it just sort of disappears, and they don't ever release it as a single thing. What was the one?
Could be true for the Blade Guard Ancient as well in Dark Imperium, not Dark Imperium, in Indomitus. Maybe that'll never come out. Yeah,
quite possibly, because obviously it depends on how that kit is combined with those other sprues and how they split them down. Because obviously they're not going to release the easy build versions of those Blade Guard, because you've got the full kit coming out at some point, which I'm pretty excited for. I was saying to a friend online recently, I actually think Blade Guard are some of the best Space Marine models like ever.
I don't think you'd have too many people disagree with you, mate.
Yeah, I think they're just like, they got the best elements of the kind of new Primaris, kind of a bit more clean cut, but better scale, better proportioned, but they still hark back to sort of the more, as they say, Crusade style Space Marines, where they're kind of covered in stuff. It would be cool if the entire Space Marine range looked that way, wouldn't it? Well, on one hand, yes, but on the other hand, no, because I actually like my Primaris to be really kind of basic looking. So actually, my stuff like so to an extent the Blade Guard, but the little Indomitus sigil that's on their gauntlets, it's like or greaves, their gauntlets. I'm sort of shaving that off of certain ones, like the Eradicators. I'll probably take it off the Blade Guard actually, just to simplify the look of them, but also give me some space for adding on some sort of pattern designs that I'm going to add when I paint them up. So
yeah, I took all the Indomitus markings off of my Outriders for my Death Watch, because I'm always of the opinion with the Death Watch, it's like if you join the Death Watch, you discard all your old markings and all your old honors. So admittedly, well, to the best of my understanding, the Death Watch weren't massively involved in the Indomitus Crusade, unless they were, in which case, whoopsie. But yeah, I can't imagine there were too many Death Watch that were rewarded Indomitus Crusade markings.
Yeah, I think every codex that's going to come out will have something to do with. I don't know, the codex has come out, so have you read it yet? Dan, is the question.
Well, I read all the numbers and unit entries.
Yeah, I'm sure there is stuff specific about them. Maybe not necessarily going on the crusade, but surely they would be supporting a crusade or being reinforced by a crusade.
Well, maybe I need to
going on a crusade seems a bit odd, because that's sort of not how they operate.
Yeah, but maybe I need to give it a read and see what's in there. You would have thought that the ranks of the Death Watch would be bolstered by the fact that after the Indomitus Crusade, that more and more kind of Primaris Marines are going to, set up shop in their appointed chapters, and they probably don't feel too close to those guys and probably want to get back to just hanging out with a mixture of different chapters and their mates and things, and just be, or not mate, but like-minded sort of Marines, and just go, these space wolves are no fun. I'm going back to I'm going to go hang out with other chapters to the Death Watch.
Exactly. Yeah.
Although that would be implying that Space Marines have a sort of level of humility, or some level of humanity to them that obviously isn't really present in their being, I guess.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah, they're not the sort of people that get sentimental about stuff, are they?
Well, they do have emotions, but yeah, sentimentality, I think, might be one of them, actually, when you have, was it Felix, or Marines that were in the Horus Heresy, but are now Primaris, for example. So they sort of harken back to the old times. Yeah, I guess they do have some level of emotions.
But that's nice for them. Good for them and their emotions, the little plucky fellows. Anyway, I reckon we can pretty much wrap this up, mate. This has been a pretty decent, chunky episode for our ongoing weekly process. Obviously, if you guys are enjoying us doing this on a weekly basis, obviously, please reach out to us and let us know how you're getting on with it, and ultimately give us your feedback, because myself and Phil are going through the journey of renewed discovery of how we do this on a weekly basis, but also how we do it as a gruesome twosome as we are now. So yeah, any feedback is always appreciated. Although don't be too mean, because we are very sensitive human beings and we don't necessarily like to be told off excessively, do we, Phil?
I mean, you can, whatever feedback you give us, do it via the medium of a 5-star review.
Well, exactly. That's the only type of feedback that we like. But look, there you go, guys. That pretty much wraps up the show. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for supporting. Thank you very much for being there. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you again next week. Goodbye, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.